Welcome back, everyone. This is Sustainability Live Singapore 2025 and my last fireside chat of the afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome Evan Lee, Director APAC Strategy and Implementation from ENGIE Impact. And we're talking key decarbonisation levers. Hello, Evan. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, thank you. It's been a wonderful show so far. We've covered so many different subjects and we're going to have a strong finish because I know we had a catch up the other day and I think the challenge for us is getting this conversation into 20 minutes. So let's get to it because there's so much to cover off. And what I'd love to start with, if I can, is the key trends you're seeing in the APAC markets around decarbonisation. What are the key movements, the main trends? What's your overall take on that?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a really good question for context setting, right? So I think if you really think about it, there's been a lot of global developments in recent times. There have been concerns about countries meeting NDCs, withdrawal of targets, and shifting investments away from renewables or decarbonization requirements. And it would be remiss for me to say that APAC is not impacted by this. It is something that you will see APAC inevitably going through a lot of the global trends, but I still think that there's a lot of existing momentum that exists within APAC right now. And so what I mean by that is, while there's been all of this action, I think a lot of the countries are still moving at a managed, concerted pace to drive towards the energy transition. So maybe just to serve an example from a country level, where I'm based in Singapore, Singapore has continued to aspire to more aggressive targets, the 2035 target of moving to 45 to 50 megatons of CO2, which actually is quite a bit of a reduction from the peaking of 60 megatons by 2030. They are working through and implementing carbon tax, one of the first within Southeast Asia. They are driving G2G agreements from a corresponding adjustments at Article 6 perspective to drive and catalyze the carbon markets. You can see a lot of things that are actually happening there. And same thing with countries like Indonesia. Even though there's a lot of discussion, there was announcements not too long ago about renewable energy in Indonesia to be expected to be increased by 28% by 2025. So what we're seeing from a policy perspective is that there is still a concerted movement that, in spite of all the other developments, is that APAC does want to play a role over the energy transition, especially because you see a lot of supply chain, a lot of things that are focused there. And if you extend it, from a corporate side, which is actually where I support a lot of companies within the region, is that the corporates are still moving and taking momentum of driving towards decarbonization. So, if we think about SBT as a common example, you are now seeing record numbers of increased companies in APAC that are setting SBTs. Remarkably, say Japan, close to 800 companies, surpassing even the UK and the US. So on that, there is an expectation that there will be a continued drive, but being very careful about what it means contextually for APAC. For one, is when you think about the challenges here of thinking about emerging technologies and upfront investment needed, is that the commercial obligations and requirements are much higher because there's an onus on making it a just transition and making sure that that actually plays well. So I would say is there's still a lot of momentum and movement on that. I see quite a bit of headwinds, but don't kind of count Asia out because it has a big place to play.
Technology is a huge question there. You touched on there about who should be paying for that because the investment can be huge. That's something I hear a lot from SMEs particularly, who have got all of these different requirements being placed upon them and they're thinking, we just can't keep up with this. What's your take on that? Because that is a huge weight on some organisations who are trying to do their bit for sustainability but are struggling to be part of the conversation. Is that something that chimes with you?
Yeah, that's very correct, right? And the main question is, why APAC? Why would APAC foot the bill for something that actually requires a global solve, right? And so I think the thing then is APAC needs to be very smart about where it's investing and where it is applicable and innovative on that side. So I would say, as an example, actually APAC has some specific problems that it needs to solve that you might not see in the other regions, and that might make sense to think about that as an investment. So let's just say, as an example, when it comes to data centers, it is something that is really, really driving right now with the global, AI boom. There's a lot of ask for IT deployment across the world. But what is it unique about APAC that you don't see in other regions? Well, for one, a lot of Asia actually deals in the tropical region. So how do you actually manage cooling requirements in this side of the region compared to where you see other wares, right? So there's developments of things like the tropical DCE, higher operating temperatures, and there's investment into that might be enough to help towards other places and transporting because that's much more of a need. Other things that you might even think about are the contextualization of even Singapore, and you think about RE imports and the idea that a lot of this constraints of lands in Singapore requires innovation on a sovereign level of the different governments and working together, right? So we have something called AAPL, the link of Australia, and then actually linking power into Singapore, and that driving level of ambition is something that's quite large. And last but not least, even if you think about it from a supply chain perspective, if you think about aviation fuel, sustainable aviation fuel, there's a lot of different feedstocks that are available in APAC, and that's something that might be worth investing in terms of technology because it is something that will then help on a global perspective. I think the other point kind of quickly to make, which you're lying to, is one is about the innovation that is tied with APAC, but how is that actually working in terms of financing? So I think where you see is there are certain bets within the region to drive these things. So for example, Singapore has grants when it comes to right now carbon capture. And so our companies, SMEs, able to leverage those grants in order to drive that level of innovation. So it's finding those avenues where you can see in terms of financing by collaboration, either across a public-private perspective in order to drive those kind of changes.
Yeah, fascinating what you're saying about innovation there and the particular challenges of the region there. Absolutely on the money. What about enablers, though, that companies should be looking to unlock? I'd be fascinated to know some particular examples you may have, given your sort of wide scope of experience in this area. What examples would you want to flag there?
Yeah. I think from my portfolio of corporates that I've been supporting, a big question always comes down to how are companies continuing to grow? And how do they grow in a concerted way that manages carbon? So what I mean by that is companies set targets. What if you make 10 acquisitions and all of a sudden your targets go different? So an example of where we've been supporting client is this concept of internal carbon pricing. So effectively looking through when a company is deciding to manage its portfolio, when it's deciding to make new acquisitions, what is the associated transition cost that you would have if you make this acquisition, assuming you need to fulfill a target. So there's a few things that you can use, parameters that we've kind of used to quantify. One could be in means of carbon tax and how it could be impacted. There's actually one in Singapore, but there's also ones driving actually across the region now. So what is the obligation that you will be fulfilling if you do make that acquisition? And second of all, if you are looking at it from a mechanism of decarbonization, whether it's to energy efficiency measures, whether it's to do with renewable supply, whether it's to do with carbon credits, how does that all feed in as an overall cost when you make such an acquisition? And I found that at least kind of that level of understanding has really worked well from a board, investor, C-suite level of understanding if I make these acquisitions and I plan to grow in this way, if these are the specific impacts I might have to future-proof for costing, so I don't come stranded, say in 2030, 2040, 2050, and not knowing exactly what I should be doing. I think another example to quickly kind of work through in enablers, and I had talked about it already, is really tapping into your governments or where you see there can be support for funding. So just to share anecdotally, I've supported a very large player in Singapore, really looking at it from a transportation logistics perspective. And one of the great enablers of doing that study, actually where they look through scope 1 to scope 2 to scope 3 and their decarbonization strategy and plan in light of the expansion, was kind of Singapore supporting in terms of a funding grant. So kind of applying together and saying, these are the things that are needed, because sorely needed. Because even if sharing anecdotally for scope 3, there's a lot of momentum from a global perspective and trying to push from a APAC perspective, but it's still falling a little bit behind. And so how do I actually get that kind of use as an enabler, as a means to actually unlock that, as an example?
And looking for that funding is absolutely fascinating as well. That's a separate discussion in itself that we could very easily fill. I do have a question that's immediately come in from the audience here that I did want to jump to quickly about carbon tax accounting. That whole area can be intimidating to learn it at first. How would you advise approaching this for someone who's more of a beginner in that particular field, getting into that area? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, well, I think for one, when it comes to carbon, there are so many terms behind it. So figuring out what you need to learn and for what helps at least orient first. So if we say, for example, carbon tax, carbon accounting, and carbon markets or carbon credits are actually three very different things, right? And if you think about kind of the basics of the knowledge, there are a lot of resources that I see kind of online. Even say, for example, ENGIE Impact has developed things in terms of scope 1, 2, 3, basics of accounting and understanding how GHG protocol works. What are the things you need to look for? For angle for a carbon tax perspective, the main thing that you have to deal with is basically working through and understanding what the regulations are. There are a quick summary. You can obviously use a lot of the, I guess, ChatGPTs or sorts to really summarize it for you, to break it into simpler words, to start with that kind of level discussion. And then from there, you can have those conversations with sustainability professionals where I say, that's where you can really drive understanding the nuances, right? You have the 101-ish level, 100 level that you're getting through online, through maybe some workshops and things like that. And then subsequently speaking to professionals really brings in that perspective that gives that flavor of what these things actually mean.
And that's very good advice. You got to learn to walk before you can run to a degree there. As we look to run out of time a little bit here, a bit of a two-part question to wrap things up with. And what do you feel leaders in the decarbonisation space should be doing right now? And the second part, what shouldn't they be doing right now? Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think, the first point I would say when it comes to decarbonization leaders is, especially where I see it in the last kind of 12, 24 months, is that you must drive commercial value or be understanding of how your actions tie with commercial value. So if it means kind of understanding what greenifying portfolio is, if you're thinking about green products and so forth, you need to be able to articulate where is the demand and where is the supply and make that connection point of those things. And basically tie it always back to the business values of the respective companies. Because I think that is always asked, when I've been working with companies, it's like, what is the needs based on this? Why are we driving through that? And one thing that really helps enable that conversation is this idea of evaluating and expanding your time horizon of where these things can impact you. So what I mean by that is a lot of the times, many companies, what they do is I just orient on what impacts me in the next 12 months. But really, a lot of the impacts of climate change or decarbonization has to be seen with a little bit of a longer term investment scenario in which you have to make the upfront investment there so that you can play in that, right? So this idea of license to play, to work through the future proofing, are things that leaders should be articulating and treating as part of a conversation. As for what leaders should not do right now is, I don't think you should give up. There's a lot of kind of noise in the system, and what we need within the sustainability or decarbonization community are the voices who will continue to drive and push for that transition and to work for that level of collaboration. So I would say is, don't fret, make sure that you connect with your peers and try to continue finding those path forwards. Make sure that you kind of steer it towards a way to drive towards decarbonization.
You've been so generous with your time, and I've got two more questions that have come in. So if we can answer these in bullet point form, that would be wonderful, just so we can look to wrap up on time. Here we go. Let's do these quick fire. Carbon tax and offset regulations do vary across regions. How can I verify if the purchased carbon offset credits are valid?
Yes. So carbon offsets very quickly. There's compliance and voluntary markets. Most of the markets in Europe are compliant, but here, most of them are voluntary, barring the carbon tax requirements. On the carbon tax requirements that are compliant, you will have specific whitelists and everything that is needed. For example, Singapore tells you exactly what can be applied versus not. So you need to follow that carefully. When it comes to carbon credits, that's where it's a more voluntary space. And to get that certification and understanding is really working with the registries and making sure that those things are actually accounted for in that way. There's sufficient retirement and all those stuff. So you need to work with the registries and the different players to understand it from a carbon credits perspective.
Thank you very much. And one last one. This one's from Robert. What does the data show? Does a typical APAC company get more GHG reductions per dollar by investing in energy efficiency or in renewables?
So I think energy efficiency in general should have reduction in terms of cost of carbon. The main equations are always upfront capex and also to do with payback periods. So it's just finding those series of projects that meet within your payback period requirements that would actually drive towards that. So you have to make that evaluation in on that. In terms of renewable energy, it's country specific, right? There are certain countries that have below grid. There are some that are above grid. And there are ones that even if they're above grid, as long as you're able to have those conversations up front with your developers, you might be able to ink a long-term deal that allows you some level of security and supply that manages it in terms of cost. So I would say is you maybe have it cascaded depending on your market approach. Find the ones in which the cost premiums or there's a cost reduction for you to apply on renewable energy, PPAs, on-sites, and so forth, which we kind of work through. Then kind of transition to the newer ones as you kind of develop along.
Ivan, thank you so much. You really know when someone knows their stuff, when the bullet point answer includes more detail than most people would know in an entire book. So Ivan, thank you so much for joining us and for those quick fire answers on the end. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining us at Sustainability Live Singapore 2025.
No worries. Thank you, Neil.